Pain is powerful, isn't it? You see, the unfortunate reality for those of you who are hearing my words right now is that you have experienced some form of pain in your life. Maybe what you've experienced is the pain of loss. Someone you love got a diagnosis. And before you knew it, and before you could make peace, and before you even really knew what was going on, they're no longer with you. And some of you know the pain of betrayal. Someone close to you. Someone who's supposed to have your best interests at heart. Someone who has uttered the words, "I love you," has done something that has left you feeling like a shadow of your former self. Some of you have experienced the pain of self-doubt. That somewhere along the line you have accepted a narrative. And you've looked in the mirror and you say, "I'm not good enough. I can't do it. I don't have any worth. I don't have any value." Some of you have pain from your past. Something that you have tried to walk away from time and time again. Something that you have tried to numb. Something you have tried to drown. Something you have done to just get away from this thing that you seem chained to, no matter what chapter of your story that you find yourself in. And some of you know a pain that you just can't even really put words to. It feels like you're walking around with weather like it is outside today. It's windy and cold and dreary, and that just feels like the inside of your soul. See, pain is powerful. Because when we're in the depths of pain, we begin to view things differently, don't we? It changes the way that we view ourselves. It changes the way that we view other people. It makes us say things and do things that we would never dream of doing. You see, pain is powerful. And if you're hearing my words, the reality is you have experienced some form of pain in your story, haven't you? And for others of you, the unfortunate part is pain is almost feeling like now it's just a permanent part of your story. You know, one of the most profound stories of pain that I can relate to is actually found in Scripture. I don't know if you've been following along or watching the videos or participating in the class, but last Monday, we went through the story of Joseph. The majority of Joseph's life is a story about pain and its power and how it shapes us and how it has an opportunity to mold us. See, when we talk about forgiveness, we've talked about the call to forgiveness that God has. We've looked at the command of forgiveness, how it's supposed to be a routine part of our lives. We've talked about the choice of forgiveness. Just because it's commanded, it doesn't mean that we choose to do it. And last week, Andy started to describe some of the challenges of forgiveness. Asking the question, why does it seem so easy for some people to forgive and so difficult for others? You know, as I begin to and continue to think about the challenges of forgiveness, one of the biggest challenges is pain. because it has shaped us and molded us and had its way with us. So when it comes to this idea of forgiveness, it's easier to ignore it. Because I just don't want to deal with the pain. The pain of the story, the pain of the past, the pain of the process, because pain is powerful, and we see that in Joseph's story. We're going to be all over his story today, but I want to encourage you this week or later today to begin to read his story in Genesis 32. Because when we start reading his story doesn't seem to start with pain. His story seems to start with privilege. If we read Genesis chapter 37, verse 3, we begin to see that Joseph was his father's favorite. Here's what it says. It says, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in an old age. And he made a richly ornamented robe for him." Some of you know what it's like to always feel like you're second place to somebody. Joseph, when his story began, never had that feeling. His father went out of his way to make sure that Joseph knew that he was loved. And if his words weren't enough, he actually put his feelings and thoughts into a gaudy robe that Joseph wore and everybody saw. He was the firstborn son of the woman that Israel loved. And he was perfect in his father's eyes. It sounds like a beginning to a good story, doesn't it? There was a son who was loved, and his father made him something special. That sounds all right, doesn't it? But you've experienced something that Joseph is about to experience. You've experienced a story beginning well, in about 3 pages in, or 3 minutes in, or 3 seconds into this day, or this moment, or this month that's beginning well, everything starts to go sideways. You know what this shows me? This shows me what it's like when we have painful moments in our lives. Every single one of you, I think, probably thought of a moment of pain that you've experienced when I was just going through the introduction, didn't you? Or at least you've related to say, I have felt some way before. And what we see in the beginning of we hear about Joseph is we see this reality before pain begins to have its way. And you know what that's like. You know what it's like because pain has probably caused a permanent marker in your story. And now, when you walk around in the world, you have this moment. You have a before the pain moment where I was my father's favorite and I had this richly ornamented robe and I could tell my brothers whatever I wanted. And then there's a moment after pain. See, you probably remember what life was like before the betrayal, don't you? You remember what life was like before the diagnosis. You remember what life was like before the event. You remember what life was like before you heard the news or that person made that choice, and you remember it fondly. The times and the moments before pain began to be the author of chapters of your story. You remember those days, don't you? Because no matter what, you always try to get back there, don't you? I just want to get back to this moment. I just wish things were to be different. And even though Joseph's story starts without pain, it doesn't stay that way very long. Here's what it says in Genesis 32, 17 through 18. I'm sorry, earlier I was quoting Genesis 32, 3. Now I'm going to quote Genesis 32, 17 through 18. So Joseph went after his brothers. He was at home and his brothers went away to do something, so now he's going after his brothers. And he found them near Dothan, but they saw him in the distance. And before he had reached him, they plotted to kill him. You see, even though Joseph was privileged in his father's eyes, he was a major pain to his brothers. And they let jealousy and fear and pain and anger take over their hearts and their minds, because remember, pain will make you see things and say things and do things that you would normally never do. And the answer for them was to get rid of the problem. So they did. They threw him in a makeshift hole. They ripped his robe. They plotted to tell the father that wild animals had went after him, and his beloved son, the one with the robe, the one that was privileged, was no longer with them, and they sold him into slavery. And now, pain began to be the author of every chapter of Joseph's story. He found himself sold. And he spent 13 years in prison. $13 experiencing pain. 13 years asking questions. 13 years wondering why. 13 years and beginning to question his own worth and value. And maybe during those 13 years, he probably said something like this: maybe my brothers are right. Maybe I don't have worth. Maybe my father was wrong. Maybe I'm not special. Maybe God doesn't care. Maybe I deserve to be exactly where I'm at. And the way I feel, I deserve that too. "13 years of asking questions, 13 years of replaying every event, every moment to say, maybe I just shouldn't have gone after my brothers. If I would have just stayed at home. Wondering what if. And for some of you, it's been longer than 13 years. Some of you, whatever pain you've experienced, the pain that you're carrying with you, the pain of your past, the pain of your perception about yourself, you have carried that with you your entire life. And you've asked the same questions over and over, and you've asked questions about your worth, you've asked questions about God's presence, you ask questions about what truth is, you've asked questions about all of these things. Because some of you know what it's like to be a prisoner in a reality that somebody else has created for you. Pain is powerful, isn't it? Pain is powerful enough to alter your perception. Pain begins to alter the way that you look at yourself. Begins to alter the way that you look at other people. And eventually, you begin to look through your entire life through this lens of pain, don't you? It becomes your identity. Just becomes part of who you are. See, pain is powerful. And we see that in Joseph's story. Betrayed, left for dead, sold, exchanged to whomever he could serve the best, and his life had absolutely no value except for what he could produce for other people. And if he dared to step out of line, if he got something wrong, if he didn't do something just exactly right up to somebody else's specification, his entire life was on the line. Sounds like a dream, doesn't it? What a wonderful life. You may be asking yourself, John, why do you like Joseph's story so much then? It's dreary outside. This is not a very uplifting story. It's Mother's Day after all. Come on. See, pain is powerful. But that's not the most powerful parts of Joseph's story. Because something happens in his story. Something changes. Something begins to be altered as we continue to read this story. You see, what I think is that somewhere in the midst of his pain, Joseph makes a decision. He can't control most of his reality, right? He's a prisoner. His days look exactly the same. But what he can control is how he begins to move in the pain. You see, somewhere along the line, I believe that even though it's not in the text, that Joseph begins to pause and process in the midst of this pain. If you've followed along at all in the book Forgiving What You Can't Forget, she has these 3 wonderful chapters that describe this process. And she uses 3 words that begin with C, and those help me to remember. She talks about this idea of when we pause and when we begin to process through the pain, there's 3 things that happen. She talks about collecting the dots, connecting the dots, and then correcting the dots. For those of you that are kind of lost to what book I'm talking about, it's Forgiving What You Can't Forget by Lisa TerKeurst. Arguably one of the top books that I have read or experienced on forgiveness. And here's what she talks about when we pause and we begin to process in the middle of the pain. She talks about collecting the dots. Pausing enough to pause from the pain and say, I'm going to simply reflect, and I am just going to put myself in a spot where I begin to collect information. You know, in my story, home for me was very volatile and violent growing up. The only piece I was in control of was controlling my own world. And eventually my father's story changed and we had peace in our relationship. But as I began to pause and process, almost 20 years later, by the way, I began to collect some dots in my own life. I began to wonder what happened in my family, what baggage unintentionally was handed down to me to carry. I began to reflect on my mom's childhood and my dad's childhood, and I remember sitting outside at my dad's lake house by the smoker, because when there's a house full with like 8 kids, 6 and under, he would always sit outside by the smoker for at least 10 hours. I never really understood that for a little while, and then you have children, and then you say, wow, I'm incredibly jealous of this man. And I began to share some of these things that I was collecting with him. Dad, here's what I'm realizing. And you know what he shared with me? He shared with me, he said, oh, yeah, John, we probably should have talked about this at some time. My dad left us when I was 18 years old. I went to the military, and my dad left. And the only reason my mom, your grandmother, survived with my two younger brothers was through the help of my uncles. Wow. I collected that, and guess what I was able to connect? The times when I felt that my father was physically present but emotionally unavailable. The times when I connect that my father and I had healed our relationship in terms of what we decided, but there was a lack of intimacy there in the way we connected. You see, I collected that information and I began to connect it and say, you know what? This probably influenced some of my dad's decisions. Later on, after he passed, my dad's a kind of a pack rat in certain ways, or was. We go through all these files, most of which can just be burned and nobody would miss anything in the world. But you know what else I found? I found a letter from my dad's father. And you know what it said? It was critiquing my dad's decisions on his career choice. Now, son, I just don't believe this is a really smart move for you. It was one of the last times my father ever communicated with his father, and it was a letter critiquing his decisions. Do you think that influenced my dad's life? Do you think that probably somehow trickled down to me despite my dad's best efforts? You see, we all have things in our lives that are a result of pain. My dad carried them. And unintentionally, and also because some of his decisions, now we were infected by some of that same pain. So what I did is I made a conscious decision in my story to say, listen, what I have has enough value for me that I want to pause. And I want to say, you know what? I need to just figure out what some of this is. I want to figure out my anger. I want to figure out why these are my certain defaults. I want to try to figure out why I feel this way or why things never happen. And I began to collect the dots. And then through talking to people, I began to connect them and say, wow, this begins to make sense now. And now I can have a choice that I can correct the dots. To say, you know what? I can make choices now that can control how much pain my daughter inherits from me. I can make choices now that can make other people understand that I love them and care for them, even though it was never in my muscle memory because it was never taught to me. You see, I think this is exactly what happens in Joseph's story. 13 years. And instead of saying pain is just a permanent part of my story, instead of just saying this is just the way it is, instead of just saying, you know what, my brothers are right, my father was wrong, instead of just saying God doesn't care, he doesn't exist, you know what, he began to pause and he began to process. And maybe some of the things he saw were this. Maybe he began to see the pain of other people because he lost his mother at a very young age. She died giving birth to his younger brother, Benjamin. Maybe he began to see the pain that his brothers were carrying. To say, what was so special about me? Why was I singled out? Why did he direct all of his love for me? And I think somewhere in this process, he began to correct the dots. And since he couldn't control his outward reality, he began to correct the dots of how he began to view himself. And he began to say, you know what? Regardless of what's going on in my world, it doesn't change my gifting. Whatever violence has happened, it doesn't reflect my value. And he began to work this up inside of himself, and we see this in his story, don't we? Instead of reacting with violence, he begins to reflect upon himself with value. And we find this changing his story. No longer is he in chains, but he's in the presence of the Pharaoh, and he begins to use his gifting. This very gift that caused him to end up in a hole is the same gift that causes him to stand next to the most powerful man in the world at the time. See, his gifting didn't change. What was going on in this world did. It reminds me of the quote we talked about 2 weeks ago. The quote is this: "We can't change what we've experienced, but we can choose how that experience changes us." You know, I can't go back and change the things I've experienced as a child. I wish I could. I tried for years. But you know what I can change? I can control how that changes me. You see, pain is powerful, but it doesn't have to be the most powerful part of my story. Because Joseph's stories changed. David's stories changed as well, but we'll talk about him at another time. See, the pain was there, wasn't it? It's not like the pain just automatically left in his story. It's not like in those 13 years of prison he began to connect the dots, or collect the dots and connect them, and then corrected them and say, my pain is gone. You see, the pain was present, but it wasn't in control of his story anymore. He used his gifts and he began to move forward. See, one of the biggest lies with pain is that we just need to move on. You've heard this before, right? Somebody that has heard a painful part of your story has meant well and said, you just need to move on. You know what moving on implies? Moving on implies that I simply drop something and walk away. And any of you that have experienced any form of deep pain know that is literally impossible because you carry it with you. You can pretend you don't. You can dress it up. You can paint it. You can say, well, this is just who I am. You can blame other people the rest of your life if you want to. See, there's a difference between moving on and moving forward. When I decide to move forward, that means I am choosing to carry something with me, but I'm taking a step in a new direction. You see, Joseph couldn't leave the pain behind because every moment he lived or breathed or opened his eyes or took a breath of air, the pain was a part of his story. It had led him there, but it didn't have to keep him there. So he moved forward. He moved forward in this new journey. You see, this is why it's so important to pause and reflect. Even though pain is one of the most challenging factors of forgiveness, when we pause and we reflect, we can collect and connect and correct the dots. This is why it's so important. What would have happened if Joseph never did that? He would have been stuck in that identity. He would have been stuck in that place and would have written and had influence over every single chapter in his story, he would have moved forward with the wrong perception of himself. To say, you see, I don't have value and I don't have worth. He would have moved forward with the wrong perception of other people. If he would have never collected and connected the dots, he never would have began to try to understand some of the pains that his brothers were carrying. It doesn't excuse their actions, by the way. They don't get a free pass. But he can try to understand. And he begins to put it together. And you know what? It takes time. And it takes a volitional and intentional choice on our part to say, I don't want to stay in this pain anymore. And if you are in that situation and you cannot control your reality around you, if you cannot control any aspect of your life, you can choose how you move forward, even if somebody never hears you utter the words. I thought of this phrase, don't let pain make you miss the power of forgiveness. Because even though that word is never used in Joseph's story, we see that somewhere along the line, after pausing, after reflecting, after collecting and connecting and correcting the dots, Joseph moves forward through forgiveness. He began to process his pain. And he began to put things together the right way. You know what? That's the most powerful part of his story. His choice of how he wants to move forward through the pain is the most powerful part of this story. And that's why on this dreary Mother's Day, I love telling the story of Joseph. Because you know what? If you remember the story, if you're going to read the story later, it's not too long after he begins this process that he is in the very presence of the people that caused him pain. Face to face. Face to face with the people that have altered over 2 decades of his life. Face to face with the people that didn't care enough about him, that sold him, left him for dead, and didn't care. You know, I've thought about that a lot this week. Thought about the emotions, the feelings, the rage. Joseph was powerful at that time, wasn't he? He had all the power in the kingdom. You know what? He could have said, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. He could have commanded people to go dig a hole. Here's your new home. Hope you like it. But he didn't. See, for a long time in my life, that was a very foreign concept. Like, I believed God could do it, but I never really met anybody that had had that happen in their lives. It's one of those stories like, yeah, I know that's possible. God did that. It's a miracle thing. It has to be a miracle thing. Because the pain I carry, if I were to see that person face to face, and they were to come and say, could you help me? I don't know if compassion would be my first response. Years ago, the answer would have been violence. 3 years ago, it would have just been blatant ignoring. Know what happened about 6 months ago? It started to turn into kindness and compassion from an event that happened in 2003. 18 years to turn my response of violence into one of kindness and compassion. I'm not going to write Christmas cards. I'm not going to send text messages. I'm not going to send selfies of exciting things that are happening. But I have reached a place in my heart where I say, I want the best for you. That's what happens in Joseph's story. He tests his brothers, because I believe trust is earned. And he realizes that their hearts have changed as well. And then there's this beautiful passage. And it talks about, how's my dad? How's my little brother? Those are the first questions he asks. He doesn't ask, how dare you? How could you? He says, how's my dad? And how's my little brother? You see, don't let pain make you miss the power of forgiveness. Because that is the only way that a story like that is possible. And it's not forgiveness of my own volition. It's not forgiveness of my own work. It is something that is only possible through God. The same God that Joseph thought was absent, the same God that Joseph probably thought created these circumstances that allowed him to end in this hole. It's the same God over those 2 decades that worked on his heart. You know, in the end, Joseph's family is reunited. The Pharaoh says, take whatever you need and you go get your family and you bring them back. I want you to take chariots. I want you to take horses. I want you to take all of these things and I want you to go get your family. And he does. And do you know what? It's better than before. Because even though Joseph didn't have pain in the beginning charts of his story, it didn't mean that things are perfect. The favoritism, the backbiting, the jealousy, all of that is gone. You see, that can only happen through the power of forgiveness. Joseph's story ends this way. Joseph stayed in Egypt along with his father's family. He lived 110 years. It's a long clip, especially in that time, right? And said to the 3rd generation of Ephraim's children, also the children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were placed on Joseph's knees. And do you know what he was able to tell them? God will take care of you. And he will meet your needs. You know why he was able to tell them that? And have it not just be one of those Christian things that people say and you know they really don't mean? Like, oh, I'll pray for you. Like, no, you won't. Have a good day. I'm pretty sure you don't mean that, but whatever. Because that's what God did for Joseph. God will come to your aid and He will provide for you. Because in the darkest pit of my pain, that's exactly what He did for me. You see, that's why it's important for us to pause and process, because otherwise pain is going to control our entire story. It could have very easily been said by Joseph in this. I probably said David 2 or 3 more times, but it's Joseph. Joseph could have said, you see, pain lasts forever. And I don't know what you guys are so happy about. But he doesn't say that. Because he made a choice to move forward through the pain instead of just trying to move on from the pain. So I have some questions. How big of a part does pain play in your story? Maybe you have entire chapters of your story that are filled with pain because of somebody else's choices. Maybe right now you're experiencing some of the pain that I mentioned earlier, the pain of loss, or the pain of betrayal, or the pain of self-doubt, or the pain that you just can't seem to verbalize. Maybe that's a leading character in your story right now. Maybe it's just like one of those annoying characters that people write into a story. You know, when you're watching your favorite show and you have that character that you just hate. Maybe that's the role pain is playing in your story, but it keeps getting written back in every single season, and you don't understand why. So how big of a part does it play into your story? Can I just share something with you? If you ever find yourself having volatile emotions and you don't know why, if you find yourself distancing yourself from other people and you don't understand why, if you've ever had this feeling when you've looked at a couple or somebody else that's successful or whatever the case is, and you began to say, why can't I just do that? And you start to play the record in your head of self-doubt. If any of that has ever happened to you and you've never been able to figure out why, it may be rooted in pain that you're just trying to move on from, and you've done such a good job of camouflaging it from yourself, you have no idea how it's affecting you now. I went to counseling in seminary, and I had no idea how my parents' divorce when I was in 6th grade was affecting me as a 32-year-old man with a family and a house. Until somebody said it. John, do you think your parents' divorce is affecting you in a negative way? Is that possible? I'm a grown man. I have a house. I have a career. It's entirely possible. I have self-image issues, and I remember candidly in 4th grade when I walked in with glasses, I remember everybody laughing at me. Tears rolling down my face and on my new glasses, and you didn't know what to do with them, right? I remember that day, 30 some odd years ago. Second question I've asked every week for 5 weeks. We didn't ask it last week, but that's okay. I wanted to give you a break. What is something, or who is someone, that you need to make the choice of forgiveness with? It doesn't let them off the hook. It doesn't excuse what they've done. but it removes the power of your story from this place of pain, and is a conscious decision that you are making to say, I don't want pain to be the author of my story anymore, so I'm going to place this in God's hands. I want to move it from here to here, and I'm going to trust Him enough to give me what I need to take the next step forward in this process of forgiveness. Some of you have thought about the same thing every single week. Some of you are thinking of something new right now. Some of you set it on week 1 to say, yes, this is the thing and this is the person, and you made a conscious decision, but now week 5 you're saying, I still need to. What happened? Nothing has happened in these 5 weeks. This is why it was so powerful what Andy shared last week, is when Peter comes up to Jesus, how many times do I have to forgive? It's not that people are going to keep being imperfect, because that's true. We know this, right? Because I'm imperfect. It's the fact that when I come to different points in the process of forgiveness, when I am triggered, when when Joseph saw his family for the first time in over 20 years, he was triggered. All of these pains, all of these emotions, all of these people are there, right there in his face. And now he has to make the choice again. That's what I think Jesus' words mean in that moment. How many times do I have to forgive? 7 times? No. 70 times 7. Why? Because you are going to keep having moments and times and struggles and choke points and obstacles in this process of forgiveness as you process, and even with yourself, when you need to say every moment, every day, maybe every second of this process, I choose the power of forgiveness over the power of pain. Well, I'm stuck. Maybe today you need to make that choice again. Choice to say, I'm literally still going to take it off of circumstances I can't control, and I'm going to put it in God's hands and let Him work with it. Because of this event over, 2003, 18 years ago, I need to make that choice every day. There's moments in that process when I have looked back and said, I am choosing forgiveness today. Would you pray with me? Father, we know that pain is powerful. And Father, it has directly impacted the way that we view ourselves and view other people and view reality, and even the way that we view you. And Father, if there are moments in our story or times or chapters of our stories that we feel stuck in, would you help us right now? Whatever we're carrying, wherever we're at, wherever we want to go, we simply ask that you help us. Help us with the pain. Help us with the process. Help us with the things we can't describe, or the things we can't control. Father, would you just help us? Same way you helped Joseph and David. Same way you helped Paul and your disciples and Abraham. Father, would you help us? Because when it comes to pain in our story, when it comes to choosing forgiveness, Father, it's hard. Just help us. We ask that all in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.